Everyone. I'm Bill Squadron, President of our Energy Policy, and thank you for taking the time to join us today for this very important discussion about America's aging electrical infrastructure and what we are going to be doing to address it, particularly in light of the new legislation that has passed the Congress and is now being implemented by the government. We have a distinguished and outstanding panel that will be discussing this issue, and we look forward also to your questions. Want to remind everyone that the questions tab on the right side of your screen will allow you to type in questions. We will get to as many questions as we possibly can toward the latter part of the hour, so please let us know if you've got questions. I really want to thank all of our partners today. They are committed to supporting our mission of bringing diverse voices together in civil and substantive discussion to convert those conversations into resources for our policymakers, media, and others who are working on these issues in the energy space that challenge us. So thanks to all of our partners. And in particular today, thank you to our co-host Bracewell and our moderator from Bracewell, who I'm going to introduce right now so we can get started. I'm delighted to have with us today as our moderator, Scott Siegel, a partner at Bracewell and the co-chair of Bracewell's Policy Resolution Committee, an expert in this field for several decades across energy, environment, natural resources. And Scott will be introducing the rest of our panel. And so, Scott, take it away. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. I hope everybody can hear me. That'd be great. It's my pleasure to join for this Our Energy Policy webinar. I think these webinars are incredibly useful and a wonderful product that the organization should be justifiably proud of. And it's my pleasure today to welcome everybody to another in the Energy Leaders webinar series. This one on the future of America's infrastructure, and we're going to focus specifically on some of the challenges of the grid grid infrastructure and transmission infrastructure. As Bill said, I've been doing this for about 3 decades in Washington, energy, environmental, natural resource work here at Bracewell, which is a law firm. The Policy Resolution Group is the government relations and strategic communications group. We have a bit of a focus on energy and environmental policy development. So with no further ado, let me introduce our panelists. We have with us today Pat Hoffman, who I'm sure many of you know, who is the acting director of the Grid Deployment Office at the Department of Energy, and has had various roles. I've known and worked with Pat for a while, and has had various roles at DOE over the years. I think she may be having a little bit of camera difficulty, but we do have her by audio. Also joining us is Karen Whalen, whose picture I see. Hi, Karen. An old friend, and also the Chief Executive Officer of the GridWise Alliance. The GridWise Alliance is a top-notch organization focused on support for grid modernization efforts. Karen is a recognized expert not just on grid issues, but on clean energy and clean energy transition issues across the board. I first met her in one of her large variety of capacities, working for leaders both on Capitol Hill in the administration and environmental NGOs. So welcome, Karen. And also with us is Chase Weir, who is the co-founder and executive vice chairman of Distributed Sun. That's a leading solar developer and operator, both community, commercial, industrial, and utility scale developments in 15 states. And he's also chairman of the Earthshot Foundation. So welcome, Chase. First and foremost, can everybody hear me? Right? We're all okay? Okay. Well, let me go on ahead and get started. So as your moderator, I'm going to ask a series of questions. As we get into it, please don't, those in the audience, please don't be shy about sending us your questions and thoughts that you might want people to react to. So let me just start on a more general basis. In consideration of America's energy infrastructure, what do you see as the biggest challenges and the biggest threats? You guys have a great degree of visibility into this. So what do you see as the greatest challenges or greatest threats to modernizing our energy infrastructure? And why don't we start with you, Karen, and then we'll perhaps go to Pat and then to Chase.
Sorry about that. I think the biggest challenge is not that we can get to our goal of decarbonizing the economy and as well as modernizing our infrastructure, but the pace at which that's going to happen in different sectors. So we have to modernize the grid. We have to decarbonize our generation. We have to electrify our transportation system. We have to find ways to increase the efficiency of industry. And the pace at which those things are going to happen is different depending on where you are, and match and smoothing that transition. So, for example, you talk about electrification of transportation. You look at what the auto manufacturers are pledging to do in terms of electrifying their product line, and then you look at the grid changes that have to happen in order for the grid to be the platform to support that. And the timeline is different. And so I think that the infrastructure package that Pat's kind of leading the charge on will really help to accelerate some of the transition that needs to happen by de-risking some of the policy decisions that those who have to approve investments need to make. And I think that it's going to be, the next 5 years as that money flows into the economy is going to be really important for figuring out how to accelerate the changes that need to happen.
Well, thanks for name checking Pat, because she's got a front row seat for implementation of these energy infrastructure, the big bipartisan energy infrastructure bill, and then subsequent programs that are designed to implement it. So Pat, let's bring you in on this discussion. How do you see the challenges to transformation of energy infrastructure?
So thank you very much, and thank you for having me here today. I agree with Karen that the biggest risk is managing the transition and the pace of transition. And I think definitely the infrastructure bill will help with respect to organizing the approach that the states, the utilities, and regions are going to focus on with respect to infrastructure investments moving forward. I would add to what Karen brought up and saying supply chain issues are going to be something that we are going to have to deal with as a challenge as we invest in our energy infrastructure, and as well as the ability to do some scenario analysis and look at from a risk perspective, whether it is further climate events or extreme weather events or cybersecurity events, that we got to keep pace with that. But as I look at investing from the bipartisan infrastructure law, it's a great opportunity to have the states lead with strategic goals and objectives in investing in our infrastructure through the funds that are available, as well as industry to take some priorities in advancing capacity, technology deployment, and also transitioning communities with those investments.
Chase, you've been overseeing the build out of projects in 15 states. So you're already, your feet are already more than a little wet on all this. So what do you see as the big challenges?
Yeah, sometimes it can be fun to be on the bleeding edge right there at the front line. And listen, I apologize. I'm down here at the Aspen Ideas Festival, and I don't have press credentials, and nobody asked me to report on it, but a lot of people a lot smarter than me talking about these topics right now. And I guess I'm gonna cheat. I'll try to assign credit, but I think we all know that we've taken our electricity grid for granted, electricity in this country for granted for over 100 years. And it's very much to do with why we're such a wealthy country. John Doerr on Monday night talked about decarbonizing the grid at speed and at scale. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, sometimes you have to realize that, there's a fight worth having, and you need to go into the ring. And I'm going to quote somebody else, and the importance of this is I've never quoted this person before. You got to jump in the ring, and you got to be ready to take a punch and throw a punch for the children. That was Nancy Pelosi. She's right. She's right, and so is John Doerr, and so is Eric Schmidt. He said energy is a business, and it should be treated like one. But now we have a mandate to move fast. And I have to tell you, we all know that ports and bridges and roads are important. I don't know that the average person thinks about our electricity grid as the critical infrastructure it is, nor that it needs to be overhauled at a blistering pace. And asking developers and independent power producers to invest all the capital up front to do that is like asking auto manufacturers in the 19 teens to pay for all of the roads up front. And that doesn't make sense. So I think that we need to socialize those costs. We need to unlock the interconnection queue. We have 1.2 gigawatt of projects in jeopardy there. Some are saying as many as 80% of those will fall out of the queue. And we need to address competence and more like bandwidth and standardization and policies and business process at all the authorities, the state, local authorities, the utilities and the RTOs, that frankly, with maybe a little bit more people resources and a little bit of help, could do what they already do well, and just do it faster. Just take an application and respond to it with a study and make decisions based upon those findings. And that's really where our challenge is, because if we're going to electrify the transportation grid at the pace that we intend to, and I think we'll probably get into this in later questions, we've got a lot of other challenges in these macro challenges. They get down to the street level.
Well, that makes sense. Hey, since I've got you on the horn right now, one of the big things that sort of entered the fray from a rhetorical perspective, or at least maybe a policy perspective too, is the rebirth of energy security as an issue. It isn't all a discussion of global climate change or the future of the green transition, defended from well-placed environmental arguments. Now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the demonstration of how fragile our supply chain lines are you finding it, Chase, easier or harder to defend and to advance investment in clean energy under conditions of enhanced attention to energy security?
Scott, I think we could probably stop and spend the rest of the session on this topic or the rest of the day. I think reasonable people here are allowed to disagree on the topic of what we're confronting, but what we're confronting in Ukraine is real, and what we're confronting writ large with supply chains is real. Trying to figure out how to take apart that question. I have opinions about exporting gas to Europe that increases prices here, not doing so and making them vulnerable there, and visiting the cost upon the United States at a later date. I think security also has to do with the decision. I think there's a very interesting point here. There's quite a divide today in how we're addressing solar as a critical supply chain, and polysilicon and lithium and all the battery chemistries. There's some 24, I think, multi-billion-dollar manufacturing facilities either under construction or on planning, and you don't see that with solar right now. You see that stuck in the Department of Commerce. So I think this is a very deep and complicated topic, and frankly, I would love to talk about it for a long time. But yes, energy security, safety, reliability, resilience are all in play here, in addition to Ukraine and a variety of other topics I'm sure we'll address.
Yeah, I was going to say I'll let others take a piece of that as they see fit, but you're under no obligation to answer it per se. Maybe it's something better for Aspen than maybe for the strictures of this webinar.
Well, Scott, but I think what one thing that Chase didn't mention is cybersecurity, and Pat knows this better than I do, and I'm sure she's gotten some scary briefings that she can't talk about. But we know one of the most publicized hacks in our power sector happened in Ukraine, and you can see the videos where you watch the guy's cursor moving around, on the screen with power controls for a power plant without him touching his mouse. So we also know that our grid is being attacked on a daily basis, and that it's a continual challenge to keep up with the attacks. They're not coming from some guy sitting in the basement. They're coming from a nation state. When you talk about I've always talked about how we maintain a standing army and we don't ask people to pay for it specifically. We socialize those costs through our taxes. And the same thing happens with cybersecurity. And I think we need to do more of that. When you look at what was in the infrastructure package, proportionally, there was a lot less for cybersecurity than there was for a lot of the other things that we actually need, resilience and flexibility and other investments in communications and things. We need those, but we certainly need more money in the cybersecurity provisions at the programs at the federal level, because that will help us defend the grid, which is the critical lifeline infrastructure that everything else depends on.
Well, let me bring Pat Hoffman into this, because we now have laid on the table here cybersecurity, and we also obviously have the other challenges related to grid modernization, including placing of new technologies, new demands. I think about energy storage technology. I think about the advent and expansion of electric vehicles, for example, and just the overall more significant amount of renewable or intermittent energy sources on the grid, also a challenge in one way or another. Pat, from a Department of Energy perspective, what are the big challenges you're focusing on in that area? And I'm not asking you to rank order them, but I think all of them are important in their own right. What do you find to be the big challenges in that area?
So I think it's a great question. I'm going to back up and just say energy security is an important issue. And as we think about our infrastructure, we really need to stress test it in such that we understand where the supply chain vulnerabilities are, where the dependencies, interdependency vulnerabilities are. But with respect to your question you brought up of integration of technologies and what are the top challenges to kind of the grid, it varies. And I think that's what we really need to do an analysis around and think very hard about. People say, what about, say, just for, clean energy generation, distributed generation? I think the challenge is the availability and visibility of that technology. It's not the technology itself, we can integrate it, but how to best integrate it. And as Karen brought up earlier, how to manage the transition. I think about other things that I'm extremely excited about is the integration of storage on the system, whether it's customer storage or storage at the transmission system. The challenge with that is value in the marketplace valuing energy storage. From an opportunity point of view, it's a cost-effective, or it's an opportunity to provide cost-effective services such as essential reliability services, generation firming, and load management. And so I usually say the devil's in the details, but as we look at integrating and moving to clean energy and meeting the administration's goals, it's all about managing the transition and thinking out how to best integrate the technologies moving forward.
Thanks.
If I can,
please.
I can just chime in here. I don't want to boil the ocean, and I will always defer Karen and Pat when it relates to transmission level threat. But I actually just have an internal memo, and I don't like to read when I'm talking to a group. But I hope that between our national laboratories, the ISOs, the RTOs, folks like that, authorities, utilities, the folks who operate our nuclear power plants, that I don't have to worry about this stuff. But it's going in a new direction with the grid edge and the distribution grid or distributed energy resources. NREL has established a cybersecurity certification list of recommendations for interconnecting grid edge devices and inverter-based resources. And I think there's a key point here. The hyperactivity around the grid edge, including rooftop solar, battery storage, now charging and EVs, widens the aperture of attack vectors, like a bigger surface area for potential breaches in the cyber world. All these devices are connected in some way to the internet and electricity infrastructures of our country. Policymakers and industry have to mandate secure features and verification, certification of that security at the device network and system level for all interconnected equipment. Industry can't do it by itself.
There's a lot in there that Chase, a lot in there to unpack.
About that one topic.
Yeah, let me dive in a little bit on EVs specifically and the challenges they might present to the grid. You know, I started off live. Karen may remember this thing the first time we ever met. I was dealing with what we euphemistically now call liquid motor fuels, but these, you know, consumers enjoy internal combustion engines because you can quickly and predictably fill up your tank with gas. There's an expectation that's met there. EVs need fast charge in order to sort of mimic the expectation of the consumer for in the EV context. But I wonder if you could opine, maybe this is good for Karen or Pat, if you could opine a little bit on, as we shift to meet those consumer expectations and look for quick charge, is the grid ready for that today? Does it necessitate microgrids for areas that might have a lot of these quick charge? What does the future hold there?
Well, we just put a report out on that, and it was thanks to a question that Pat asked us in December, and it's a report you can find on our website, gridwise.org. And we looked at with our members, utilities, grid manufacturers, you know, equipment manufacturers, many of whom are also in the EV charging space. And we asked the question, what are the near-term investments that we need on the grid in order to support this accelerated transportation electrification? And I think what our members, at least our utilities, they're not worried so much about accommodating the gradual or even a little more rapid increase in residential electrification of transportation, you know, gradually adding more EVs, passenger EVs. What they are worried about, and not necessarily from a capacity standpoint, but they're worried about the timing mismatch of fleet electrification. Because if a fleet owner is not talking to the utility, you know, early on in their plans to electrify their fleet, they may find that where they want to put their fleet, which may be immovable from their standpoint, doesn't work for the hosting capacity on the utility side. And it might take the utility 2 years to go through the planning, engineering, and construction process to get the grid ready for the fleet. So what we looked at were, you know, as we think about, and that's just addressing load and possibly some beginnings of time of use charging, some managed charging, meaning that the utility is helping to decide when the charging happens. That's not the same thing as vehicle to grid integration, where we can aggregate vehicle batteries and have them deliver services to the grid. When we looked at what we want, no regrets investments as the utility is making those investments to accommodate this uptick in transportation electrification. We want those investments to be the platform by which we can start to do vehicle to grid integration when we're ready for it. And so we looked at things like hosting capacity models. We looked at distributed energy resource management systems, DERM systems. We looked at transmission or substation upgrades and a number of other things, but all no regrets to actually get us in place for later true vehicle to grid integration.
I think Karen's brought up some great points, and just want to echo those points with respect to, we have a great opportunity to really set the stage on how to best integrate electric vehicles at the distribution system along highways and rights of ways. If we're talking about long haul trucking, the easiest is fixed use vehicles. We have to think about the appropriate charging infrastructure. We have to think about opportunities for vehicles to support the grid or customers as well moving forward. And so this is a huge opportunity to really look at the charging setup, the charging cycles, the timeframes. What does the grid need to have for support? Talk with the utility commissions, talk about rate designs, and really get aggressive around the electric vehicle infrastructure so we can build this from the ground up with the opportunity that we have here.
Chase, you want in on this? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, just in sharp relief, just to say something I know we're all saying. but we're about to move off of liquid fuels onto electricity or kilowatt hour fuels. That's a pretty radical shift. If we're going to ask our distribution grid to be America's gas stations, then we need to be ready for that. And again, back at the street level, you need to understand that much of our transport, the medium and kind of the harder to solve, the medium and heavy transport, it also is, you know, that dirty fleet is affixed oftentimes to dirty facilities. And so if you understand scope 1 and 2 emissions, you can clean up the facility, you clean up the fleet, but then park that at the facility and put that facility underwater on its scope. And I think Pat and Karen know that you might be able to figure out a way to pull 300-500% of your load in one site and maybe across the street, but you do that in industrial park, you're breaking the distribution grid. And that's without even talking about what you hear when you pick up the phone and ask these manufacturers if you can buy 100 or 200 of these vehicles for delivery in 2023. Even if you have sterling credit and billions of dollars sitting around in petty cash, you feel like you're looking for a Rembrandt or a Matisse, or you're looking for buried treasure. We need millions of these. And I'm not going to tattle on these guys, but we're talking to Daimler and Tesla and Nikola and all of them. And their answer kind of reveals where we are on this topic. But as soon as they remove that friction and throw that at the distribution grid, you've got the other problem. So we all need to be in the fixing right now.
You know, Chase, not to be the skunk at the garden party, but I see a world when I look at automobility that will have a larger and greater role, obviously, for electric vehicles as time goes by. But I think we would do well, and it's not your business, but we'd also do well to focus on how we decarbonize what will remain of liquid motor fuels. And that's why I think it's kind of interesting that we're seeing a lot of these projects, particularly in the upper Midwest, to flange up carbon capture and sequestration to capturing the process emissions from biofuels, because there's always going to be a chunk of the market that it's going to be liquid for a while. So at least for all of our professional lives together, they'll still be ICE engines. So I'm not asking me to respond to that, but I'm just like laying it out there. I do want you to respond to this though, as long as we're talking about EVs. One of the things we've been talking about, and this is true of both EVs and it's also true of renewables development, which is the supply chain and specifically critical minerals. The International Energy Agency says it takes, I'm recalling these off the top of my head, something like 6 times the amount of critical minerals that go into, say, a wind farm in comparison to the same amount of name-plated, combined cycle natural gas. For automobiles, I think it's 9 times actually for that. For automobiles, 6 times the amount of critical minerals in an EV versus an ICE engine. So critical minerals is a major part of the supply chain issue. We're hearing lots about it, particularly, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what happened to the world nickel market afterwards. How big of a deal is that? Do you think it's something that there are reasonable ways of addressing that are on the table right now, or is it an obstacle to the EV transition? So I don't know who wants to answer that first. It's kind of a high.
I'll start if you don't mind. I mean, DOE's published a report around some of the secure supply chain challenges in February, in which that was in support of the executive order looking at supply chains. So we recognize that domestic manufacturing, in addition to critical materials, are absolutely important and something that we should address. We did a deep dive on 13 different reports as part of the supply chain. A lot of them focused on the ground roots with respect to materials obstacles. But you look at what you just talked about with lithium ion batteries, the materials resources, the raw materials for lithium ion batteries, which includes cobalt, nickel, lithium, manganese, iron, graphite, greater than 50% of the mine production of those ores are controlled by 3 or fewer countries. And so as you look at not only just the raw materials and the ores, it comes to the refining of those materials. And China does a lot with respect to refining of these materials to produce, as well as the subcomponent manufacturing. And so I think we have to look at the whole supply chain and think about the technologies that we're going to invest in moving forward to build domestic manufacturing, not only from the materials development, but all the way, or raw materials, but all the way to the recycling of the materials. And so we have to look at the whole value chain.
Right. Anyone else want to touch base on critical minerals? It's not everyone's favorite.
No, I couldn't agree more. Listen, this is an important topic for us as well. It's impossible for us to address the needs of our customers to roll out tens of thousands of trucks without understanding these topics. As soon as we're worried about cobalt and copper, you hear Tesla say that 50% of their batteries LFP and they'll need them. As soon as we really lean into lithium, and you talk to the innovators, the engineers, and the experts around us, they tell us there's solutions to that. I think we all know we have all lithium in the world that we need under our feet. It's about political will and our decisions to pull it out of the ground. But I think that these are paramount issues, right? It's one thing to know that we have solutions to them. It's another thing to execute those solutions.
And I'd also add that the economics are changing. So we are seeing the first the growing domestic lithium production. There are a couple projects in Nevada and in the Salton Sea that are going to pull lithium out of domestic production. And we're also seeing a couple companies that are beyond startup now in the battery recycling business. So we have a demand push and pull going on, and there's of course energy security issues, because these minerals are not just important for batteries. They're important for other clean energy resources like waste heat recovery, some of the catalysts that get used in a variety of processes, and also in the Defense Department for some of the things that they do too. So there's just a growing attention that it has to happen domestically. And so I think, going back to the administration's reports and planning, you are going to see a big push to really bring that production back. Well,
yeah,
develop the production here.
This is a great discussion. I would note, sometimes people think when they hear lithium ion battery, and Pat did a good job of demystifying this, when they hear lithium ion battery, they think that it just has lithium and it just has lithium in it. But the truth of the matter is the battery architecture requires a lot of different minerals. And we talked at the beginning about nickel and what that looked like after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Still a little worried about that. The United States has one nickel mine and it's closing. And the places where nickel comes from either tend to be under rainforests or tend to be in Mother Russia. And those are not places we really want to be. But I am enthusiastic that we're thinking in terms, Chase referred to the political will, that we're thinking in terms of having the political will both to look for more nickel resources in the US and even to look at deep seabed resources, which were all the rage in the 70s, and then everybody forgot about them. Now they seem to be, with using new technology, seem to be focusing there too. And that seems like an exciting needle mover potentially. Okay, too much on nickel. I should kick myself on this, but it is one of my favorite topics. Okay. Chase, while I have you and while we're talking about supply chain, I would be remiss if we didn't spend, and I think we can afford it, 1 minute talking about one of the real critical issues on the solar side. Anybody else can talk about this too. These solar trade cases. I mean, there's a report out today, right? Maybe it came out last night, that basically says that 3/4 of the major solar projects in the US are stalled or potentially stalled because of shortages created by the business uncertainty and price changes related to these unfair trade practice cases related to solar. Thoughts on that? Is it going to be resolved sometime soon? How do we get ourselves out of that box? Easy question.
Yeah, no, that's super easy. It's super easy. I mean, you're in a different realm, which is almost like a business finance capital markets about sunk cost losses. right? You know, because there's a lot of working capital at play that if it doesn't pay itself back, it's going to get written off. And that's capital that can help us grow. And so if you write off the capital that comes in to help us grow as a country, that's a bad cycle to get into. Look, you said we're in 15 states, we're in 14, but I was so joyful yesterday to give notice to proceed on a bunch of projects across, I don't know, 4 or 5 other states, 3 new states to put us at 17 that locked in supply and pricing. And I've got a lot of friends and colleagues who, because sometimes businesses are growing with an assumption of just everything's great around them and that things are going to grow quarter over quarter, and they plan their working capital that way. And then when they hit a speed bump like this, you talk about laying people off and ripple effects down through to our goals on climate. You said, I don't know what you said, 3/4. My data says 46% year over year decline on solar installments this year just because of what's happening to commerce. I don't want to get into the opinion part of that, but well, I will. That company nobody's ever heard of, right? Less than $10 million per year in revenue. Okay, so it's one thing to say that people are, you know, cheating, and China is going through Southeast Asian countries to get around trade restrictions, but it's another thing to understand our current role in that value chain as a country. And right now, all the jobs and all the opportunity for growth is not around manufacturing; it's around everything that comes after it that you stop because of that little company in Palo Alto or wherever they are. The Secretary of Commerce has the authority to call that out for what it is, and I hope that the Secretary does it.
Yeah, I believe she's on Capitol Hill today, and she'll have the opportunity to respond in kind. Well, let's. I don't know if anybody else wants to talk about solar trade, but if not, then we can shift a little bit. I will tip my hat to Pat Hoffman and say Secretary Granholm was up on the Hill last week and was pretty clear that she thought this was a problem, not one that she could fix directly, but certainly a problem that needed to be addressed.
Can we just stop and say that the U.S. Department of Energy is performing as a federal agency better than any federal agency in recent memory right now? And we should applaud Pat and everybody over there for the work they're doing. It is incredible. And other agencies should follow their lead, including Congress.
Team. I totally agree with you, Chase. It's a great team over there, and it seems to be working quite well.
Thank you very much. We are working hard. I really appreciate the comment.
But it's true. That's why it's so easy to say. They're leaders, they're thinkers, and they're doers, and they're applied practitioners.
Right. I know it's not solar, Chase, but on the wind side, I sat down with the wind team at DOE, and what really blew me away is these are true experts dedicated to their craft. And it was.
I wasn't saying good things about the wind people. Okay. Yes, wind's also important.
That's right. That's right. Right. Okay. Let's switch gears a little bit now and talk about the bipartisan infrastructure package. In a sense, we've been talking about it already and some of the implementation challenges, but I wanted to get people to talk a little bit. We know what we got in the bipartisan infrastructure package in terms of some proposals to address expansion of charging stations, for example, so infrastructure in that context, some transmission language. Yes, we're waiting on a second piece that sort of fits hand in glove with what came in bipartisan infrastructure. That second piece, which may or may not be included in a reconciliation package, or may come at the end of the year in a tax extenders package, or may come in a combination of the two, includes the so-called green energy tax credits. Everything from 45Q for carbon capture, to wind, to solar, to advanced technologies that have performance characteristics associated with them. I won't ask you to predict tax policy because I think that may be beyond all of our scopes, but I'll just say this. How important is that we get that second piece across the line, and what's your confidence level? So I don't know who wants to talk first. Karen, you used to work for the Speaker of the House, so I think I'm going to start with you. Karen, what do you think about that? How important?
I think that the way that Congress has been dealing with tax credits for energy has been, to the detriment of the industry. There's been very little certainty, although we are generally certain that we're going to get a tax extenders package. But we do it in fits and starts. We don't do, a 5 to 10 year extension with, a guaranteed ramp down that you can look at and have some certainty. We do it every year, and sometimes it gets, sometimes it's the full, retroactive, and it's not a great way to send signals to the industry. But I have a fair amount of confidence that even if there isn't an infrastructure, another Build Back Better, that there will be an extenders package. There's just a lot that has to be done. So then the question is, how much is the new things that we've been talking about? For example, the storage tax credit. We have the storage industry and the utility industry that we're worried about the normalization issue, I think, have a fix. So we wouldn't see what we saw, a couple of years ago, where we were going to do a tax extender package. We thought storage was going to be in there, but in the end, they didn't have agreement on the normalization. So I think we're at a place where we have agreement, so that if we were going to have an extenders package, the storage piece would be in there. But I don't know. I mean, I know there are ongoing discussions with Senator Manchin and a bipartisan group of senators about some smaller package than the plan for Build Back Better. I don't know how much Congress is going to get done between now and the midterm elections. And so I think there's some will, but I'm not sure. There's also a whole set of things that other people beside, other interest groups wanted out of a Build Back Better that were beyond the energy sector. And so the child income tax credit and all of those things that there are other advocacy groups out there pushing for, they're all going to get wrapped up, because Congress isn't going to do one big thing on energy and not deal with the other things. So I'm a little skeptical that we're going to get something. And I will say, to defend the grid, when I looked at Build Back Better and I added up all of the things that were in there for energy, so the tax extender, the tax package for clean energy, the growing incentives for electric vehicles, distributed energy resources, and others, and I added up everything that was going to be plugged into the grid, it was somewhere on the order of $253 billion of things that were going to be plugged into the grid. And because Congress had this no double dipping rule that they placed on themselves, there was no additional money for the grid. And so that Smart Grid Investment Grant Program for flexibility that we think is so important to build out the grid, and Chase, you mentioned that we need it badly, that's only $3 billion. It was $3.4 billion in the Recovery Act. And there's obviously other money for the grid, but in the infrastructure package. But we had a meeting with some people who are going to make some recommendations to the secretary about the Smart Grid Investment Grant Program. And after we were finished with our conversation about the needs, the leader of that group said, "Wow, it sounds to me like we need more money." And in fact, we do need more money in that, if we're going to be asking the grid to be the platform for all of these things. So we've been advocating that if Congress is going to do another package, that they really look very closely at adding money again back into more money for you, Pat.
Speaking of
Scott,
that,
can I jump in here?
please, I was going to ask you, how important is this tax component? And of course, Chase, I'm sure you'll have thoughts on it too.
So I'll add my thoughts to it. It's very important, but I will say it's one tool in the toolbox of a suite of things that we need to keep in mind as we're trying to get technology and infrastructure investment across the finish line. Let's just take transmission. The transmission tax credits would be helpful with adding transmission capacity, but we all know there are several other issues in getting transmission built in the United States. DOE just last week, for the $2.5 billion of borrowing fund that's available for transmission, put out some guidelines for what is called the anchor tenant, or subscribing to capacity on transmission lines. That just addresses one issue with respect to transmission. We have the permitting and siting issues around transmission. And so as we think about this, where DOE is heading and how we're looking at the bipartisan infrastructure bill and how I'm looking at grid modernization, is how do we take a comprehensive approach to use all the tools in the toolbox, complement it with things that hopefully can be advanced in the future, by getting things done. So you can look at resilience investments with the infrastructure bill, the modeling, the incentives that are out there under the infrastructure law, but partnering with the states to make sure that they have the capabilities to do integrated planning, to do scenario analysis. So just in the areas of investing in our transmission system, so I'll back up, transmission system, absolutely one of the highest priorities from a clean energy perspective and a resilience perspective. We need to use all the tools that are available and possible to get that done. The same thing with the distribution system and looking at the resilience in the United States.
If I can just chime in from a business perspective on tax credits, and I won't contradict, I agree with everything that Pat just said, but maybe looking at it from a profit and loss and capital account planning pro forma spreadsheet perspective, as a business, I try not to be in the business of planning around whether or not politicians can or will agree to a bill or whether a final version of any new law will adhere to sound legislative policy. But I do know that whether it's 245 or opportunity zones, some of these tax credits aren't very well understood and aren't taken up as well as they could. Storage would be, I think, a bit of a boon to that side of the equation and should be supported just like solar. I think it's more important to win. But what's really important in an inflationary environment with Fed tax hikes is that we have profitable private capital markets at a macro level in order to have the profit-driven tax obligation there and available to fund infrastructure investments with real and knowable tax appetite for forward planning. And that was the point earlier about when you have a 3 or 5 year policy, it's not clear and you have to wait till last minute whether or not it's going to be in an extender bill. It's really hard to wrap your head around that. And in solar, we're probably the one that's closest to wanting it out of our capital stack. But in this environment of inflationary prices, costs going up, theoretically, our cap stack needs it more than ever. So we are in favor of it, and we hope they get to that. And we also know that's a lot easier than some of the other battles on capital. So we expect it will happen.
So yeah, just from an issue spotting perspective, some of the things, and y'all should feel free to respond to any of these as long as we're talking about this question of tax credits. You know, I frequently hear clients tell me that they would like to be able to decomplexify some of these renewables investments, but because you have taxpayers and non-taxpayers that are involved, and that leads people inexorably into the direction of direct pay in our tax code. And Karen, to your point, I'm not sure that's the kind of thing you can get done in an extenders bill, but it's the kind of thing that you could get done on a reconciliation bill. So I don't know if you think that, if that's within your experience, that you think particularly on the transmission side or elsewhere that having direct pay approaches could be a game changer. I don't know. Does anybody want to answer that? You don't have to. It wasn't on the sheet. You don't have to answer.
Hi, Scott. Can we actually turn to questions from the audience?
You know, you're like a voice from heaven. Yeah, that'd be super.
So a reminder to our audience that questions can be submitted on the dashboard, but for the panelists, the first question is, what are 2 or 3 of the most important R&D challenges to modernizing the grid apart from cybersecurity?
Well, I can start with that as getting storage, long duration energy storage out, the technology advancements done from a storage perspective. We have great advances with respect to what I'll say shorter duration storage in the 4-hour time frame. We do need to bridge the gap to that longer duration. In addition, I would say the development of a clean fuel moving forward. We've had part of that conversation moving forward, whether it's hydrogen or an alternative clean fuel source. We do need to have that technology advance to get to a clean fuel from that perspective. So those are really 2 of the highest priorities. And then other things from an R&D perspective, I think goes back to the supply chain of alternatives from a technology development for, say, transformers, looking at power electronics, ways that we can support the building of our system from a resilience point of view, but leapfrogging technology, recognizing the challenge and build the next generation of manufacturing jobs. The last thing I would say is actually the researchers is having the folks available and graduating from the universities to get into the research space and the manufacturing space to develop the next generation technologies.
Wow, great answer.
Yeah. And I'm not going to jump in on the actual technologies because I agree with Pat, but I will say that, the utility industry, which has traditionally been very conservative, moved very slowly and adopted new technologies with great reluctance, and the regulators also, have been part of that reluctance, are changing, and because the technologies are changing so quickly in the electricity sector that some of these big utilities who never dealt with startups before and really left the innovation to other people now have their own innovation centers. And I think that's a big change because they're looking for ways to identify those new technologies as they come off the lab bench and try to figure out if there's a place for them in on the grid. So that's a new and exciting change.
Yeah,
Thank you both. Next. Sorry, go ahead, Jason.
Sure. I mean, innovation in and around laboratory. There's also just innovation around the cost curve. When you have global industrial commons coming into a segment, I think the first time we bid on a microgrid project, over $1 million a megawatt hour. That price has gone down over 90%, and there are big expectations going forward. But there is that valley of death, and Karen's right. I mean, financial institutions, when you think about the bond-like risks that are expected out of power assets, nobody wants to bet on something that has not yet been operating for 20 or 30 years, even if everything else about it is great. And I'm not promoting this company, but people need to look at companies like Bear, BEIR, that figured out how to pull 300 to 500% more electrons across our transmission infrastructure.
One of our members.
That's a radical, and I'm not speaking to the technology, I'm speaking to the premise. That's a big deal, and that removes a lot of other obstacles, and people pay attention to that. And then on the other side, this discovery of superconducting and processing, the Josephine diode, for over 100 years has befuddled us, and looking at 300 to 500x more processing power at lower heat and using less electricity, which is the whole point. If you really pay attention to where the new electricities needs are coming from, oftentimes it's the data servers, or I guess minting Bitcoin, but there are some really remarkable technological solutions that I think we know work today. We should speed up and roll out.
Great. And Leo, before you go on, I just want to draw two circles. One around the absolutely fantastic amount of attention being paid to hydrogen development these days. You can see it. It's palpable within the Department of Energy. It's palpable within the investment community. It's truly everyone's favorite element at this point. It's number one on your periodic table. And the other one is, look at the prices that these offshore leases have gone for offshore wind. And that goes to the point that Karen was making about how these are over the horizon, no pun intended, technologies that investment groups or utilities are now taking a gander at, despite the risk profile. That I think is just impressive, and we're just seeing a green and growing edge for technology at this point. More very interesting. Leo, what else we got?
Absolutely. Next question. In terms of cybersecurity risks, what do the panelists have to say about local power via municipal utilities, community solar and storage, community choice, and other models of local energy autonomy versus traditional long-distance interstate transmission?
If it's the context of, yeah, go ahead. Please go ahead.
All right, I'll start. I guess cybersecurity has no boundaries. So I'm going to start with that and recognize that when we're talking cybersecurity, we're talking about asset management, data architecture, software, firmware, secure communications, I would say third-party providers as a service. So whether it's the transmission system, the distribution system, a municipal co-op or an IOU, or even a third-party provider, everybody has to pay attention to the cybersecurity threats. And I think we have to really take a hard look at some of the cross-cutting issues. As I have said, data architecture, asset management with software and firmware, secure communications. We all have to mature as an industry. I think we are maturing. I think we're well further in advance than where we were 5-10 years ago in understanding the threat, the landscape, the vulnerabilities, access points. We have a lot more to go with respect to analyzing the supply chain and securing it, but at least we're testing products now, standards are developing, people are really advancing with respect to their maturity levels of this.
Thank you, Pat. Next question. Although largely a distribution level issue, voltage drops and surges and other power quality issues are increasing and are increasingly expensive. To what extent are infrastructure upgrade and expansion plans addressing these issues?
Want to take that, Pat?
So under the Recovery Act, we did a lot of work looking at voltage support in the distribution system. And I think we have to continue to look at what I'll call power quality, signal issues, and really what I'll say is go from an initial analysis of where signatures or events are occurring on the system to greater fidelity of analyzing root causes. And so those voltage support is critically important. Reactive support is critically important on the transmission system. If anything, I think we just need to continue as we add renewable energy, as we add technologies to the system, is manage that transition and understand how to support the network and the distribution system moving forward.
Yeah, and it's a great question because we actually, many of the customers that are plugged into the grid need better power quality than they needed, 5-7 years ago. So there are real economic costs to that, those fluctuations. But I'll say that a lot of the new technologies on the grid are designed exactly to do what Pat's talking about, which is to manage the voltage and frequency, including new smart meters that actually help send signals back to grid operators about the fluctuations and where they're coming from, and allow millisecond management. So we can do it. And if I could, I'd get on my soapbox about smart meters, which is that we thought in the Recovery Act that by 2020 we would be at 100% deployment of smart meters. We're nowhere near 100%. In fact, I have a graph that shows that BNEF predicts that we'll get to 93% deployment of smart meters by 2030. That is not fast enough, both for the power quality issues that you raised, for the resilience issues of knowing where power disruptions are happening, but also for the equity of customers to be able to participate in the emerging markets at the distribution level and at the wholesale market under FERC Order 2222. So it's a big, it's the building block of a smart grid. That's those smart meters, and we've got a lot of work to do there.
I agree with you. 15 seconds before we finish. I think it's important to note that, as I said, that surface area for attack, or those attack vectors, increasing because of the distributed energy resources. It's also our pathway to have a much more secure grid, right? You can't have a tree branch fall on an electric line in Pennsylvania and black out New York City under the new modern grid that we have to roll out. It's a lot more secure. The ancillary services from these batteries help balance out and balance the grid out very, very effectively when it's done right.
Honestly, I hate to jump in on what has been such incredibly insightful and far-ranging discussion. When you think about what we covered in the past hour, from electric vehicle infrastructure to tax credits to critical minerals to energy security and more, it underscores how complex and challenging this area is. But your insights on this were phenomenal, and I really want to express our gratitude to Pat, Chase, Karen, and Scott. We do promise everyone that we'll get them out punctually at 1 and Eastern, and we keep to that. But I would encourage everyone to go to our energy library, which is on our site, which has and you can see the link. It has extensive resources, materials, studies, reports, papers, and so forth on this topic, which we'll be highlighting. So for further information about it, we'll be publishing a summary of the stimulating comments from today's conversation. So I want to thank all of you in the audience for taking your time to join us today. Thanks again to all of our partners for supporting us, particularly to Bracewell, our co-host today, and to Scott, our moderator, to Karen, Chase, and Pat, our gratitude for taking your time and sharing your thoughts and perspectives with us. So we look forward to seeing you again soon. I wish all of you a good rest of the week, and look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thanks again for taking the time today, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.